In the year 2000, Martin Amis wrote his first ever piece of sustained non-fiction, a memoir called Experience, which is part autobiography and part a portrait of his father, Kingsley Amis.
Experience is the only thing we share equally, and everyone senses this. I'm a novelist trained to use experience for other ends. Why should I tell the story of my life? I do it because my father is dead now, and I always knew I would have to commemorate him. This will involve me in the indulgence of certain bad habits. Name-dropping is unavoidably one of them. But I've been indulging that habit in a way ever since I first said, Dad.
You were the son of a famous person. Kingsley Amis was famous in this country. So you grew up with a sense of fame. Looking back, how do you think it affected your own view of fame?
Well, it became, very early on, it was just the air you breathed. And, nothing is more ordinary than what your dad does and what he is. And so I could see that, it had its disadvantages, and in fact had no advantages except for the fact that it, helped assemble your readership. But it hardly gets you a table in a restaurant. I could see that he didn't exult in it in any way. It was part of the job. So fame, for me, is I think I'm inured to I think the reason I get all this treatment is because I am his son, and that it looks like I had a kind of launch pad and a set of inherited genes that meant that I didn't have to try very hard.
There aren't many examples of fathers and sons or mothers and daughters who are equally successful and famous as writers, but Kingsley Amis and his son Martin are certainly a prize example of that. And when Martin wrote this extended memoir called Experience, he was bound to write about his father, because his father was so much of his experience, obviously as a father, but also as a writer whom Martin rated extremely highly. I lived in the same street as Kingsley Amis for many years, and we used to meet quite regularly and go to the pub quite regularly. And he didn't take to Martin's, or he said he didn't. I couldn't quite work it out, because at the same time he was envious of Martin's success. This tension, I think, is well shown in the film. Martin's very careful about his father. There is, in what Martin says about his father, so much affection and respect that you knew that despite Kingsley's sometimes blusterings, you only drink to get drunk, for instance, which he did most days of his life, were again not much more than skin deep, and that there was a huge admiration and a certain awe for what this younger man, this younger writer was doing. This interview is based around your book called Experience, which was the first non-fiction that you've written. What made you want to write it?
Well, I always knew I'd have to write about my father, more or less as a kind of pro bono act, because of the rarity or indeed uniqueness of our case. Two writers with a body of work out there at the same time. And when he died, I thought, well, now.
Can you develop that a bit? What's so exciting about that?
It meant that our relationship had all the usual vicissitudes of a father-son relationship. It was universal in that sense, and yet unique in that it was a literary friendship as well.
Your mother, Hilly, whom he met when she was 17?
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about her? Because she seems, in a way, as distinctive as does Kingsley.
She's a very remarkable woman, and anyone who's ever met her realizes this. She's very straight and very innocent in her soul, and I said to her that, whatever I inherited from Kingsley, I got just as much from her. A sort of, she's completely untheatrical, undesigning person, and never judges anyone. She grew up not in the city but in the village with animals. And the book is called Experience, but she's the obverse of that. She is the innocence, some of which I inherited.
It was just a very normal family, I thought, until I met Kingsley, who thought we were very abnormal and frightfully sandally and goody, really, which I suppose, you know, we didn't swear and we didn't drink. We didn't do any of those things. We were too busy playing instruments or trying to play them, which caused huge guffaws from Kingsley and co.
I think there's this curious duality all the way through Experience, which it's very fascinating if you're interested in Martin Amis's writing, as I am. You know, it is an essential thing to read. You do very strongly get an impression of someone who is divided between his father and his mother, and of course the wit and the sharpness and the ambition come from the father, and there is this very gentle, sweet side to him that we don't often see as in the reading public, which is his mother.
Kingsley Amis was famous in a particular and important way in the 50s. I mean, I was reading Lucky June when, whatever I was, 40, with my father, and we were screaming with laughter. And that was happening all over the country. When I knew him a bit, as quite well at a certain stage of his life, he was tremendous.
He was an engine.
He was, yes, a force. Can you assess sort of what it was like compared with any other sort of experience?
Well, you can't, and you know, a child is by definition used to anything, you know. You have nothing to compare it with. But I don't know of any of my contemporaries or near contemporaries who got on so well with their father.
A major theme in Kingsley's work, which you tackle in the book very straight, and a major part of his life, was his close relationship with women, from the romantic to the adulterous. Can you tell us about this? I mean, you describe his romanticism, also you describe him as a constant adulterer.
Well, in his first marriage, he was...
Yeah.
No, I mean, extraordinarily energetic. I mean, it was quite difficult to be, you know, a hyperactive adulterer in those days, but he managed it.
But I don't think he liked women much, really, basically. He thought they were silly and selfish and daft, and it was very unfortunate that he was made as he was and was tremendously randy in the early days. And, you know, very keen on all that side of things, and more bigger choice, the better.
And I think my brother and I were, you know, largely formed romantically by the things he used to tell us. But they were good things. I mean, for instance, the most sexually attractive part of a naked woman is her face. Very appealing to hear that at the age of 15. And he said also that the sensations of sex are much magnified by love. And that really set the cat among the pigeons, because we thought, that's why we've got to fall in love, for the sex, you know. But he always made it clear that this was the prime value, the first value, love, romantic love.
I think there's a pull inside him as a man between the one and the other. I mean, where did monogamy fit into romantic love?
With difficulty. He said, you know, that on his wedding day, he was looking down the street and fancying women.
But first of all, when you're writing a book of autobiographical memoirs, honesty is obviously important, and what always bothers me about autobiography is that I think it's a protection racket. And memoirs, I think a great title is Unreliable Memoirs. If you go with that, how did you tackle those?
I would agree with you entirely about unreliability. I mean, no one's memory is more than 70%. But there did seem to me, you know, as it emerged, there did seem to be a kind of consistency of preoccupation, because in a way I was, you know, the whole process of writing the book was a condensed period of mourning for my father. But I don't think that a memoir is necessarily self-protective, and you know, what you find out when you write the thing is is whether you, in fact, you do have access to grind, whether you are energized by animus or grudge. And I was actually scandalized by how little of that I felt in me. I used to say to myself, come on, you must be a bit more vicious than this. But I found I didn't. There was nothing I regretted or blamed anyone for. You know, I thought, what a lucky life is what I kept thinking.
In public, writer Kingsley Amis was full of fun and bonhomie, but in private he suffered from a crippling number of anxieties. He was a writer of great distinction. But he was a very strange man in many ways. I mean, his phobias were fierce. He hated being alone, he hated making arrangements, he hated going in aeroplanes, and that's just the first letter of the alphabet, isn't it?
A 5-bob flip at the seaside at the age of 10 was it for flying. He never went on an aeroplane.
And he was terrified of the dark.
Lifts, trains, buses.
He really did hate being alone, and it was probably when Martin and Philip were very small indeed, he'd sort of panic if he was left alone.
Sometimes, when I was 5 or 6, I would hear him screaming in the night, really authentic, growing panic. And my mother would bring him into my room and wake me, and he would sit there sort of, while I talked about what I'd done at school that day. He would sit there looking at me sort of admiringly and trustingly. And I'd say to my mother the next day, well, what was all that about? And she said...
His way of dealing with it was to take me and himself into the children's room where they'd be sleeping, and he'd sort of managed to pull himself together, you know, by looking at them.
Which was a tremendous inversion of you know, parental filial feeling that a 6-year-old boy can calm a 35-year-old man by his very presence. But you just accept these things about your parents, don't you? Whatever they, you know, things that look really odd from the outside, you just, without a second thought, it's just their reality, and you assimilate it.
When Hilary discovered that Kingsley was having an affair with the novelist Elizabeth Jane Howard, their marriage broke down.
He fell in love with Jane Howard. You know, that was the real thing. He really was very much in love, and I suppose we were at the vulnerable stage in our marriage.
So then he took the line of least resistance and married Jane. But it meant 4 months where we didn't see him, and it was ghastly. I mean, we became almost comatose.
Well, I was his wife for about 16 years, and I was the wicked stepmother of Martin, as he says.
I went to pieces. It was very tough, really. There were awful ages for it to happen. And the school got disrupted. It kept changing schools. And generally lost heart, I think. He needed to be guided firmly, and that's what Jane Howard did very well, I think.
Jane Howard herself is a considerable novelist.
Indeed.
And you were landed, therefore, with not one, but 2 novelists ahead of you. Jane Howard also, as I understand it, Elizabeth Jane Howard, decided almost that you were undereducated, but very bright, and should be forced to get on with it. Is that roughly the case? And if so, what do you draw from it?
It's very definitely the case. I was averaging an O-level every other year, and I was really on the street. You know, my mother, for all her virtues, was never good at getting me to do things, getting me to study. And Jane was systematic about it, and father, you know, wanted me to do well at school, but his indolence was such that he couldn't sort of, you know, do anything about it. He wasn't really up to even giving me a bollocking about it. You know, that was too much like hard work.
I said, what do you want to do when you're grown up? And he said, oh, I'm going to be a writer. So I said, you're going to be a writer? You've never read anything in your life. You don't know anything about literature at all. And he said, all right, what should I read then? Or something to that effect. And I gave him a novel of Jane Austen's. And he turned up very short time after that and said, Jane, you've just got to tell me how this ends. You've got to tell me. So I said, no, I'm not going to. It's a novel. You have to find that out. And he used all his powers of persuasion, which were considerable, to try and get me to tell him. He was fascinated by it. So I said, what a good thing. You want to know the end so much. Go away and finish it. And then they never looked back, really.
I went on to be a writer and was always close to my father. I felt protected by him, even in the literary sense, that far from having difficulty coming out from under his shadow, I felt that I was very happy in his shadow.
Did you learn a lot from him, quite straightforwardly?
Well, he only taught me by example, really. And I did see very early on that, you know, as you know, the great thing is to get into your study and be alone there, and the words will come.
Did you feel any novelistic rivalry?
I think the biggest difference between us as novelists is that he was a poet as well. And he therefore regarded the novel as something a little bit lower brow than I regarded. You know, the duty was to be accessible and entertaining, and I go along with that up to a point. But I think I like to make the reader, you know, try a bit harder than that.
Kingsley's attitude to Martin was bizarre in one way. I mean, Martin was a great admirer of Nabokov, and Kingsley wouldn't give the time of day to Nabokov. Simply, that was that. Martin's admiration of the great American Jewish writers, Kingsley, no, weren't bothering with. And his treatment of his son was sometimes a bit cruel. I remember once we were in The King of Bohemia, and he'd brought one of Martin's books, I think it was Dead Babies, and I noticed hardback, every 3 pages, it would click down like that, click, click, click. And I said, what's going on? He said, I can't get, I read too bad, I can't get past it, I can't stand it. He won't say, the man left the room and shut the door. He's got to find, I just can't stand it. And it was about, at least, you know, 20 or 30 clicks, and still a long way with the book to go. I thought, well, come on. Also, I think, what's he telling me for? It's like to think, what am I telling you for? But I'm telling you because I think that was not simply, complicatedly, an enormous difficulty he had with taking on board that this man who had his name, this young man who'd had difficulties in all sorts of ways, was turning out not only to be a very well-acclaimed writer, but a writer going in such a different direction from Kingsley himself that Kingsley found it hard to follow and resented the fact that it was difficult for him to follow, not to understand, he was as clever as paint, Kingsley, but to follow why he should want to do this and why this was so successful, and perhaps, worst of all, why this was so good.
You have a son, Martin Amis, who is also highly successful, very amusing
Not
writer.
so successful as yet, but...
Do you find that you share and enjoy his success also, or is there slight jealousy there with comparing each other's reviews and sales?
No, it hasn't got to that point yet. There's a certain amount of envy of youthful success.
The fact that he's beginning.
Well, I like him to do it, and I admire him. I think he's a very good writer. But you can't help saying, yes, well, you published your 3rd novel when I was just shaping up to write my 1st.
I liked his stuff a lot more than he liked mine.
Did that worry you?
It was painful at first when he told me rather sort of abjectly but truthfully that he couldn't get on with my 2nd novel. He couldn't get going on it. He read my 1st and all that. And it was a great affront. It was a slap in the face.
It's very, very easy for parents to squash their children's dreams and ambitions. You know, most writers are also critics, and to have that turned on a child can be immensely destructive. And Kingsley, I think, from everything I've read of him, his letters and his biography, was an extremely destructive man. And it's, to me, quite a miracle that Martin emerged as energetic and positive, and indeed in this book loving as he is.
I now think of him not as the old devil, but as the man, the engine of comedy that he was for all those decades, the center of all sort of joy and high spirits and laughter and wit. Someone is no longer here, the intercessionary figure, the father. The man who stands between the son and death is no longer here, and it won't ever be the same. He is missing. But I know it is common. All that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity. Death is nearer, reminding you that there is much to be done. There are children to be raised and books to be written. You have got work to do.
How do you place him as a writer, Kingsley?
Well, he's clearly the comic novelist of his generation. All he ever said, he said he wanted to make a niche for himself in literature. And you know, that he certainly did. And he once said, of both of us, he said, all you can say is that we're some good, he said. And I was quite happy to take my half of that.